Hey, Doc. It's Doc. So last week, my bestie from Minneapolis came to visit for a long weekend. It was a great trip. We did a lot of things around Orange County, LA, that I had not done before. And in the days since he left, it's gotten me thinking a lot about place. It's gotten me thinking a lot about ideas of home. And I mentioned on the pod a few episodes ago that I had the opportunity to present on homework, my original contribution that originated from my dissertation that is now a book manuscript in progress. And I realized that I haven't really talked about it in depth on the pod. You are obviously very, very familiar with homework as a concept. You have been formative in its generation and its evolutions as my writing partner and my editor, and thought it might be interesting to introduce it to our audience and talk about it more in depth with you.
This is the Doc to Doc podcast.
It's voice notes turned podcast, place as perspective.
Welcome back to the Doc to Doc podcast, folks. I'm Nicole, based in Washington, D.C., where surprisingly it's cold again. So you never know. You never know.
And I'm Brett, and it is surprisingly lovely in Southern California. Shocker. Yeah. Weather Doc is not going to know what to do with this information.
Oh, man. Yeah. Ears will be a-buzzing. Who knew that it was pleasant in SoCal? Well, that's good. I mean, it's spring. The vibes are high. Coachella's over now, right? We're done with it?
Coachella is over. The influencers are crawling back to their selfie caves. I don't know what they do.
Selfie? Damn. I mean, if the shoe fits, but man, it feels that it hits hard. No, it's kind of an exciting time. New Olivia Rodrigo.
Ooh. And I mean, she was also at Coachella, so I can only hate so much when she made an appearance. So
yeah, the weather, predictable or not, spring has sprung. We're here. And I don't know about you, Doc, but I'm feeling a little bit of that pull towards summer. New music is coming out. The weather is nice.
If that single was any indication, we are going to have a boppy summer.
Let's hope for a boppy summer, regardless of the weather.
Yeah. Apparently we are going to have a rough El Nino West Coast summer is what the headlines are saying. Hot, humid, rainy, unpleasant.
Wow.
In California.
I would tell you to snowboard and go somewhere else, but where would you go that's not also hot and humid in the summer? Oof. Well, lots of places to go, lots of places we've been. I feel like that's a natural segue into today's topic, which is homework, which is on one hand, probably associated with most of us with the worst thing that you had to do after school. But on the other hand, a reclamation, and how I often think about it now, you've retooled this part of my brain, is your work, Dr. Brett, your original contribution that I was first introduced through your doctoral dissertation work. And then most recently, very joyously, through your manuscript, which is revised based on that. So I'm intimately familiar with homework, but I don't know, we've hinted on it a lot in the pod. I don't know if we've actually talked to our listeners about the new knowledge you specifically created in the world, which is homework. Yeah. So I wanted to start there. What is homework according to the Dr. Brett?
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. And I am excited to share this with listeners. And just for folks listening, you will be hearing us say homework quite a lot in this episode. And just to linguistically differentiate it from your experiences in school, it is 2 words. So it's not homework mushed together, meaning your assignments that you did at home. So homework is the labor that we engage in to come to feel at home in our body minds, our relationships, and our communities. And this is work that originated through in-depth interviews, a couple focus groups, but mostly conversations. Some of them were walking conversations through parks, in coffee shops, in places of meaning and significance in and around Minneapolis with 10 young folks who are self-identified survivors of sexual or domestic violence that they experienced while they were attending university. Again, in and around Minneapolis, some in kind of the extended Minneapolis metropolitan area. And it's a project that initially I was starting to ask questions around ideas of community, and like what community looks like, how survivors engage in community after having experienced violence, like what sort of inspired folks who had their bodies, their autonomy, their agency violated, what inspired them to want to continue connecting and often wanting to look out for other folks. That was connected to ideas of justice, because having done advocacy work and activism around sexual violence, often survivors are not looking for retribution or punishment. More often than not, if you talk to a survivor, they want to ensure that what happened to them does not happen to somebody else. That's what accountability looks like for them. And often the only recourse is some form of system of punishment, but that's not really the goal that they're looking for. They just want to ensure that other folks don't get hurt. And so I started asking these questions around community and justice. But then as I was developing this project, the pandemic started, and I was developing what the project was going to look like while in isolation during the pandemic. And then a few months into the pandemic, while I was already envisioning that this project was going to be set in Minneapolis, because that's where I did my advocacy work, and I had a network there where I where I expected it would be relatively easy for me to get participants because I could lean on my advocacy network. Then the pandemic started, and I said, okay, I'm seeing kind of how mutual aid is already coming to play in interesting ways. Communities are showing up for one another because of the pandemic. And then in May of 2020, George Floyd was lynched by the Minneapolis police force, and the city erupted in a fairly unexpected way. This was not the first murder in Minneapolis of a Black man by the Minneapolis police. It was definitely not the first murder of that sort in the United States. And so the response was fairly unexpected, I think, and how quickly protests turned to riots, not only in Minnesota, but across the United States. And then there were solidarity protests across the world while we were still in isolation. And to see this kind of response and this anger against anti-Black racism was this reignition of the movement for Black lives. And so it shifted how I was thinking about my research. And as I started doing my research and my interviews, it became clear that what we were talking about was a deeper notion than community. And really, we were talking about a sense of home. And that for survivors, where we've talked about this before, one of our favorite geographers, James Tyner, who talks about that home is often the first place where folks learn violence and experience violence, that for survivors, it's often about creating a sense of home in opposition to what we knew. And so I became really invested in this idea of how do we recreate a sense of home for ourselves, or in many instances, create a sense of home for the first time. And that's often in opposition to what we have ever known before.
Yeah, and I think this is such a good point. And I don't know if it's a delicate irony of you and I having this conversation, or even yourself being this originator of homework, because something that I think we've talked about on the pod, but you and I speak to a lot, is you and I both have an upbringing where home was not that place that felt particularly you talk a lot about this in your book, and I'm so eager for when it comes out, because it's really, for listeners, it's such a wonderful journey, both through this theoretical and research intense lens that Brett brings, but it's also very personal. You talk about home being strange and home being many places. And that for me feels really resonant given what I've talked about on the pod of both feeling a little oppositional to a lot of the values of my family, but also dealing with domestic abuse in the home and other kinds of uncertainty. So it's interesting that this is something that you would come to because we've described this as being something both part of our past,
Mhm.
but then also in where we are now in our lives, or maybe at different junctures, but certainly now we're like, you and I are both people that I think underneath everything have a lot of anxiety about things. Where I'm at right now is a good place in my life, professionally, personally, etc. Geographically, I know this is not the end point, and how I try to combat that a lot of times is by doubling down on what we talk about as dopamine decor. And so for me, it's all my weird ass antiques. It's my
Mhm.
books. It's making sure that space that I'm in feels really comforting. But I also know that there's this internal tension that we've discussed where all of that is an attempt to create conditions that are controlled in anticipation of maybe what we're feeling externally or at other points of our life. And I'm just kind of curious how you think about that.
Yeah. Yes, it's a great question. It's a great point because when so I mentioned a few pods ago that I recently did a presentation and workshop on homework. And one of the reasons that I talk about homework at these different scales in our body minds, in our relationships, in our communities is that we may feel at home or feel a sense of home at one of those degrees while not feeling it in another.
Yeah.
Where I first really started to come to feel at home in community through Occupy after my intimate relationship of several of uh 6 7 years fell apart through intimate partner violence, and that also made me incredibly unsettled in my body. My anxiety came out in new heightened ways. That was when my suicidal ideations came back after a decade and a half. um, and there are ways that I now try to create balance across those degrees. And absolutely, one of them is how I decorate my spaces, where I try to curate a sense of home in place so that because I am often unsettled in my body because
Yeah.
of mental illness, because of depression, because of my eating disorder. And that's why I put things around that bring me joy, that remind me of people that are silly, that are uh, concert posters, that's anime artwork, Pokemon shit, Legos. It's
Well, you
things
walked in
that
the back, right?
I got Wicket right behind me. I don't think folks can see this way, but I've got Grogu on this couch. Yeah, if I were to turn the camera, like there's a balance, I think, between where for some folks, my office and my home looks very similar to my office. For some folks, it might feel cluttered, but like you said, it's dopamine decor where I need to be almost inundated with joy.
Mhm.
Or even sometimes it's things that are reminders of darkness, but there is an element of control over it. And it is about this reclamation of when for folks who have experiences of home where we were out of control, where we've known violence, where we have known instability, and ways that these are all examples of our homework. These are ways that we are coming to feel at home in our body minds by trying to curate spaces in which we can try to find and create stability and comfort in the places that we operate, our offices, our home, our apartments, whatever it might be.
I'm curious about the process of homework because even I still have questions about this because we've talked about dopamine decor or I think about, I mean, what you said of like the things that are going on in my mind. Sometimes I rectify them or I try to control them by what I can physically work through. And that feels really spot on. And that people are always amazed in my social circle that when I do move, how quickly my house is put together.
Mm,
And I'm talking about like I am not the kind of person that when I move, I have boxes for months. Like it is, I move in on a Friday, by Tuesday, everything is on the wall. Part of that I've described to people as one, like I will succeed because I'm insane. But two is because I don't feel comfortable in a new space until I have sort of nested, I think is
Mm,
the domestic way of talking about it, but I feel like that's a little that connotation feels a little negative. But for me, it is in order to do the things that I want to do in the world, my house, my space needs to be clean, it needs to be put together because otherwise it clutters my mind in a way that distracts me or amplifies the rest of the clutter that's constantly there.
mhm.
And so I guess in some ways, yeah, that is kind of some of that's part of my homework is how do I create those conditions? But because that process feels idiosyncratic, it feels very individualized. I'm just kind of curious, is there one process to homework or is it genuinely individualized? And are there connections or similarities that you see or that you point out in your work of how we actually do the process of homework?
Yeah. So the James Baldwin quote, which actually you pointed out to me, because I had not read Giovanni's Room at that point, but then I did, so that I could add it to the book without guilt. And the quote is, "Perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition." It's a gorgeous quote. To answer your question, there is not one way one to answer your question, there is not one way to do homework. It is very
Okay.
much an individual process. It's going to look unique for each person. Through my conversations, there were themes that emerged for and commonalities across my conversations where I could say, that these are consistent elements in folks' homework for coming to feel at home in our body minds, for coming to feel at home in our relationships. Um, and that was often like we are trying to um, reach a similar horizon like we talked about before. And so when it comes to the homework of our body minds, that's about meeting our needs, and folks are going to have different needs. Sometimes we will have similar needs. That our homework for our body minds is about learning and personal growth, where we want to feel like we are enriching ourselves, and that's going to look different for different folks, but it's similar motivations. When it comes to homework for our relationships, some of the themes in that were about shared vulnerability. And that's one of the reasons why, like you said in the book, as well as the dissertation, it's a lot of my own personal narrative that joins the stories of my participants, because in my work, I've embraced kind of this ethos that I'm not willing to ask of folks labor that I'm not willing to do first myself. That's one of the ways that I lead with vulnerability to forge connection. And that was one of the things that I learned from this work, where I began with it in sort of small ways, but really saw how deep those connections grew because I was even just like opening up a little bit of space by saying, "Hey, I identify as a survivor too." And
Yeah.
because of that sort of small gesture, we started to forge really strong connections. And the more that I did that, the deeper our connection grew. And so that really demonstrated that like vulnerability is one of the key ways to do homework, and to build strong relationships. And then kind of the second piece for relationships is showing up, that we have to show up authentically. We have to demonstrate that our time is for other people, and that in vulnerability and showing up, that relationships are about mutual care and support, that I'm here for you as you are here for me, and that like those things will all look different, but those are sort of the foundations of what homework looks like for relationships. And then similarly, when it comes to communities, it's not that different. Like you have to show up for community. We've talked a fair amount about accountability, but again, I think that's a topic we will go into much more in depth at some point.
Yeah.
And then, similar to mutual care and support, when it comes to kind of the community scale, it's about mutual aid and solidarity. Because at the community scale, instead of the relationship scale, solidarity sort of replaces care because we don't necessarily know folks. And so being in solidarity is how we demonstrate care at sort of a collective level, if that makes sense.
So then my other question to you, Brett, is knowing that it's a process. How I would think about that for myself is that there's probably different meanings of this at different periods of time. But what then is home for you right now? I know what it was at the time of the book, or at least how the book ends
Mhm.
in the last draft, which is a bit of a cliffhanger, folks. I'm not going to spoil it because again, when it comes out, y'all better read it. Um, but what does that look like for you right now? How do you think about that?
I like that question. And to your point, yes, homework is the process, it's not the outcome. As pulling from Bell Hook's definition of love as being a process, not an outcome. And that's one of the reasons why I use work intentionally, because work really is never done. It is ongoing.
Spoken like a
And
true capitalist.
I know, oof, favorite C word, never escape it. I think the thing right now, which did not show up in the book. I think the thing that is keeping me grounded, that is bringing me a sense of home lately, is my connection with my student staff. That is a thing that is giving me a sense of purpose, that is making me feel like I'm doing something bigger than my own aspirations or my own mental illnesses, that is making me feel like I am making a difference. I think it is when I think about coming to feel at home in my body mind, I'm finally seeing a dietitian, which is something that I've wanted to do and needed to do for a long time. That is helping me reclaim my relationship um, with my body mind. We've talked about leaning into joy. That is something that I have been more successful at lately, and I am trying to continue doing that. Uh, um, in a lot of ways, like this pod is my homework, because it is something that is keeping me connected to work that feels valuable, where I feel like it is validated because we're getting lots of feedback from folks, and folks are enjoying it, and it doesn't just feel like an echo chamber. What about for you?
It's a difficult question, as it should be, I think. I don't know if anyone, when you ask this, maybe we'll see. I think for me, I think a lot of times home has always felt connected to people. So that part of your explanation, the relationships, feels really poignant because I know that I'm good at making space feel comfortable. In fact, I really love the idea of making space, as I said, clean, set up in a way that feels comfortable so as to combat anxiety. But also, I love being like a vibe curator. So there's nothing more that I like than like hosting people, leaning into a theme, a costume, whatever, to get the people going. And you know this firsthand.
Mm,
So I feel like I'm good at making space place. When it comes to home, people feel right. I think in recent months, it has absolutely been, I would say, the pod, but it's also been just reconnected a couple weeks ago here in DC with my former advisor and one of my good friends, but also somebody who's part of my PhD cohort. I'm one of the few people besides Dr. Gabby that I really liked. I didn't like a lot of people in my cohort. That person was one of them, and they actually reached out because they were listening to the pod and were saying, "Oh, I'm coming to DC." And so I had this dinner with them and it was just this moment of being like, I haven't seen you since prior to lockdown. We haven't shared physical space, and having that moment of connecting and like really feeling seen and validated and being at different places in our lives and also with a different age gap, different careers, living in different places, and having this moment where I just felt seen,
mm,
felt really validated, and I also felt brought back to that moment. And I think that's also something sometimes I feel at home with friends when it's that feeling that I think a lot of people can instantly recognize of you suddenly share space with people and it feels like no time has passed. And in a weird way, I feel like sometimes that's home for me
mm,
because it's very much these moments that I look back on fondly that bring me such joy that when I can't recreate them because I can't go back to that moment, but I can create new experiences or it feels like an extension of that. Those kinds of things make me feel, I think, the most complete. And the most safe and the most seen and like
mm,
settled. Whereas other times, if I try to place home in a particular geography, that is something that actually doesn't feel as right all of the time. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that and thinking about maybe some of these other questions. But I do know, and our listeners don't know just yet, but we actually have a little bit of a surprise.
What?
Today's episode. Oh my gosh, spoiler alert. So, on that cliffhanger, we might take a little break, Dr. Brett, and then maybe introduce our secret surprise. Well, Dr. Brett, today on the pod, we have a very special guest, our second official doc joining us. It's not you and I. I'm very excited to welcome to the pod Dr. Madison Borrelli. Dr. Borrelli is a postdoctoral researcher in planetary geophysics at Georgia Tech. Her work combines satellite data with computer models to understand how planetary surfaces form and change over time. Heavy stuff. She studies places like Venus and icy moons. In her recent research, she takes a look at Venus, specifically pancake domes on Venus, not as unusual volcanoes. I didn't even know that these were volcanoes, helping scientists learn more about that hot planet and how its surface behaves. Madison does a lot of stuff. Not only is she a postdoctoral researcher and a Venus doctor, Madison completed her PhD at Arizona State University, woot woot, and her work has been cited widely since she graduated, folks. She is also served as a chief of staff to a university president. She has been the recipient of prestigious international awards, such as the Chateaubriand Fellowship in France and the Amelia Earhart Fellowship. Madison is someone who brings curiosity to every situation well beyond the lab. I can confirm she's an international traveler. She is a close observer of people and place. One might say a queen of gossip. And by her own admission, can confirm, she is not one to pass up a dessert in the name of research or otherwise. Please welcome to the Doc to Doc podcast, Dr. Madison Borrelli.
Welcome,
Thank you so
Venus
much.
Doc.
So happy to be here. Thank you for the amazing introduction. I did serve under a particular president as chief of staff. It was my honor.
That's wild. That's crazy that you've done so many things.
Can we name that president for our listeners just to
President who shall not be named. Yes, it was one Nicole Mayberry.
Dr. President
Who, me?
Nicole Mayberry?
So nice to have you. I know you're a listener of the pod. A shout out to you for taking to heart what we always tell our listeners, which is, smash that like and subscribe button.
I've smashed every week.
It might just
Thank
get
you
you on the
so
pod.
much. So happy to be here.
Is this your
So
first?
happy to be talking to my Doc to Docs. Yes. First ever pod. I am a huge pod listener. So long time listener, first time caller.
Dang. Yeah. Maybe you can teach Dr. Brett how to become a pod enthusiast.
I mean, long time podder, first time listener over here.
Well, I have many recs. Just let me know.
Well, Dr. Borrelli, I know you're a Venus doc, and I know by admission that how I described your research is not nearly sufficient. And maybe one day we will have a planet episode, maybe something about the universe with hopefully more accuracy than like a Christopher Nolan film. But today we actually don't want to talk about your expertise about Venus, although that's very important. And we're thinking about this episode on homework. Background, your name, and you as a person came up because you are one of the few people who has both moved a lot for education and also the postdoc space. You have moved quite a bit, both domestically and internationally. And that in itself is its own feat. A lot of our friends, I think, have lived in multiple places, had lots of different perspectives. You've seemed like the person who has always had like a center of gravity, no pun intended. Like you have always felt very someone who understands what home is and what home isn't. I was talking to Dr. Brett and we both kind of agreed like your perspective on this concept of homework. You seemed like the natural candidate to have this discussion with today.
I am glad it seems like to observers that like I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think because your work, which is fascinating, is quite literally otherworldly. And as Dr. Nicole mentioned, you are doing that work all over this world, this globe, and this country, and you have a move coming up soon. And so, in order to stay grounded, I'm curious when I am engaging the work of homework. I often begin from a place of asking a very fundamental question of when I say the word home, what words, what images, what feelings, like what people, what starts to come to mind for you?
I think this is easy for me. It's Rhode Island. That's where I'm from. That's where my whole family is. I'm very close with my family. And I was very lucky to have just like a really positive associations with the place that I grew up. And it's somewhere that no matter where I go later on in my life, I always return to. And so it's somewhere that, yeah, I'm always drawn back, and I know that wherever I am, it's something that's there waiting for me when I come back. And so having that something that's just always pulling me back, that I'm always connected to, is like a home even when I'm away from home. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
And we all were at ASU at the same time, completing our doctorates relatively within the same period. And that was also during the pandemic. And so I'm curious how home shifted for you, maybe, or how you experienced a sense of home when you couldn't connect to Rhode Island or to family in the same ways when we had these limitations around travel, around connection and isolation because of the pandemic.
And I would also add that, because I also know Dr. Borrelli very well, that I think similar maybe to you, Brett, and I don't know if you know this connection about each other, but Madison hated living in Arizona
Hated
and
it.
tried
Yeah.
to never be there. So I do want to complicate this a little of like, spoiler alert, you two are kindred souls and that Arizona wasn't always the best place.
I don't
Yeah,
think it
I
was ever
saw
the
that
best
in
place for me.
no, no, not once. I saw that in your manuscript when I was like prepping for the episode, and I was like, oh yeah, I understand this. And it's funny you ask this question, because how did I stay connected to the place that I really consider home when I was in Arizona is that I left and I went back to Rhode Island. And so during like when the pandemic was really first starting, before we kind of knew what it was going to become, Dan and I traveled internationally. This is obviously because it was not really a thing yet. And while we were abroad is kind of when the sort of travel bans and things started to kick in. And so we came back, we flew back into Boston, which is where we were always going to fly back into. And then I stayed there for about 8 or 9 months.
Oh, okay.
So I was loving it because I didn't have to go back to Arizona.
Mm.
And Arizona was somewhere where my PhD took 5 years. I mean, all told, I spent 3.5 of that in Arizona, because that was never a home for me, even when it was at its best, which is like when I was hanging out with Nicole all the time. I loved my roommate. I had amazing friendships, and we were doing so much fun stuff together. And, it was always a joy to spend time with my amazing friends. It still never felt like home. Like it just wasn't enough somehow. And I was always longing to be somewhere else. And I took every single opportunity that arose to go somewhere else.
That is absolutely a kindred experience with me, because it was interesting because I think I came to Arizona sort of knowing that I didn't want to stay there. And that obviously shapes how you engage with the place. If you show up with a preconceived idea, or sort of knowing that I didn't want to get attached. I'd also had the experience of with New York, which is a place that obviously, so many folks want to be, but I ended up staying there a lot longer than I ever expected to, because I got into a relationship. And I had this fear that, like, what if I met someone in Arizona and that meant that I was going to stay there, and that I would have to put down roots there. Sort of every year was sort of a turbulent experience for me with Arizona, where I actually went through a breakup in my first year in Arizona, and then second year was pandemic, third year was isolation, and then fourth year I was hoping to have left, because I really wanted that completion fellowship that was going to allow me to go up to Minnesota and not be in Arizona to work on my dissertation. And that didn't pan out. And similar to what you said, like, I didn't start to feel any sense of home in Arizona until the second half of my last year, Nicole's last year, when things started opening up and I started spending most of my time with Nicole, with Dr. Gabby, as we were starting to think about this experience ending and leaving, that I actually started to think, I might miss this, but what I'm going to miss is this experience that I didn't know until this last moment. And that was a very strange sort of transition moment.
It strikes me as someone who has moved a lot in my life. I think when I was growing up, I think it was like always tell people it was like 20 houses, 16 schools within a period of 4 years or something. Like, but it was all within the same general space with some exception. You both have lived in a lot of different places. Like Madison, I know you've spent time living in what, the Azores, France, Maryland. I'm trying to think of all the places. You've been everywhere, in many ways, and Brett, you have as well. And something that Brett reminded me in this last bit of, especially that last year, I think, of our PhDs, but the last year that I was with you in Arizona, the year before you left, Maddie, because like you did your last years, I remember.
I pieced out.
Right. But that final year, which was like 2022, there was so much going on, and it really, at least for me, felt like there was a lot of momentum and a lot of community building, and it was great. And it reminds me of something that it feels oftentimes when you're finally getting the wheels turning in place, when you're finally making community, that sometimes corresponds with when you're leaving. So just as you're building that momentum, you're gone. And I'm kind of curious, especially for both of you, how that resonates or how that contributes to feeling at home when it takes so long to set those roots and to really feel like you have that energy and you're not just missing someplace else.
I feel like I'm in that right now since I am moving out of the place where I've lived for the last 3 years in like 6 weeks. So now I live in Athens, Georgia, and I moved here because my partner lives here and he's attending grad school here. And I did my last year of my PhD from ASU remotely because, I'm lucky that everything I do is just sort of like on my computer. And so I moved here and I've been there ever since. And pretty soon we're heading out and we're going to be moving to San Diego. And we have Athens bucket list and Atlanta bucket list. And we're really trying to make the most of the rest of our time here. And so it's kind of like a mad dash to be like, we never went to this restaurant. We have to try it right now. Or like, we loved that restaurant. We have to make sure we go again. We may never, ever be back here. We're really kind of seeing everything that this area has to offer all concentrated into a very brief time where we're like, we never went to the Great Smoky Mountains. It's the closest national park. We've got to go right now. And so the last period of time here is full of fun stuff, which we could have been doing that over the last 3 years, but we never felt the urgency to do it. And so, when I look back on my time in Athens, I'm probably going to think that was so much fun. Think of all the great restaurants we went to, all the national parks. And we crammed it all in at the very end instead of trying to really make the most of that place all the time. So hopefully I can carry that forward. And when I move again, maybe have that mindset from the beginning.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question, Nicole, because I think when we know that our time is ending somewhere, we are more reflective on that experience. We maybe appreciate a place differently than when we are stuck in the routine of our life there. Because I think routine is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, where it's both really comforting and there's something really overwhelming to me lately about routine, or the like trudginess of routine. But then when we know our time is running short in a place, or like my bestie just visited and I did all of these things around Orange County in LA that I had never done before. And I learned about like this redwood grove 15 minutes away from campus. Like I had no idea it was there, and it was just so cool. And so when our patterns get disrupted, either because our time is now finite, that our connection to a place is different. And I think this is something, Nicole, you and I think a lot about as geographers. But there's also, as soon as you were asking this question, a quote from The Office came to mind. And I think it was from the finale. Andy asks it. It's where he's talking to the camera and he says, I wish there was a way to know you were in the good old days when you were still in them.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's like, so, and I feel like that is sometimes that it's that reflective moment of, as we're about to leave, we think about a place differently than when we're just sort of stuck in sometimes the misery of a place. And so in thinking, Maddie, you've got some moves coming up. You've moved a number of times. And so I asked you sort of what home as a concept brings up for you. One of the ways that I engage this concept of homework is thinking about it both in our bodies, in our body minds, and in our relationships, and then in our communities. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about your relationships as you are moving from place to place, what your homework look like to maintain your relationships across place.
Yeah, I think one is definitely related to this podcast, right? Is the pods, right? It's the voice memos. I think voice memos are the best way that you can communicate without having to schedule a time to meet or talk. I think it's great. I love just keeping up with people as part of my daily routine. If I think of something that I want to tell, say, Nicole, maybe I'll even put it on my to-do list. Like, oh, I have to tell Nicole this funny thing that happened. Tomorrow I'm going to send her a pod. And just trying to keep people up to date of the day-to-day little things in my life. And hopefully they'll do the same with me. And then we feel like we're always connected. Instead of only saying, oh, I've got big news. Now we're going to talk. Oh, just trying to keep people abreast of the little things. It leads to a lot better sense of connection than only occasional big news talks.
It is wild to me how many people know you on that level. And I don't know if it's because you have all of these small ways that you're engaging with folks, but I also know like you talk to your mom every day. You spend a lot of your time, it feels like, or I don't know, maybe I'm assuming, but I can only imagine how much effort it takes to maintain this large of a circle where also people are both energized by you and also know a lot of stuff that's going on. And I'm just kind of curious, maybe also because I'm like Brett and I could take some notes of like how do you invest in a community like that when also your community feels like it's everywhere? There's so many people in your life that all are fundamentally, it feels like, invested in you, but also because like you make that effort. And I'm just really curious, like how do you create that network of like homework and that network of community?
I think maybe I'm just like an oversharer, which is like anything happens and I'm like, I can't wait to tell everyone I know about this. And then I do. And then I'm telling the group chat of my friends from high school, some of whom I've known since elementary school. I'm calling my mom. I'm texting, my friends from Rhode Island who are also like happen to be friends from undergrad and we just happen to be from the same town, texting them. I am telling my partner. I am texting, my friends from grad school. Maybe everyone's getting the same story, but I'm excited to tell it 5 times, which I don't know, maybe just like I like to hear myself talk. I think like this is a funny story. Everyone should get to hear it. But I always like to do this. And so I'm having different conversations with people all the time. Maybe it's spurred on by the same thing, but then it'll lead to different things. And I have different ways of staying in contact with people like across all different like apps, which maybe it means that, I'm addicted to my phone and I'm on my phone all the time. But I always talk to my mom on the phone. Like I call her. I have a couple of my friends from our lab group and grad school, and we have, for some reason, we use Slack. With my friends from high school, we have a Discord channel that we use to stay in contact with each other. So we've got all these different things going on that, it's just whatever works for that group, I'm on board. And I try to be engaged in whatever that group chat is. I'm not letting a group chat die. I'm in there. So,
and I'm having a thought, and I don't know if there's value in this thought, but I'm going to share it because as Venus doctor, you're our first interplanetary doctor, and there's not intended to be any judgment in this sort of comment or question. But in thinking about the nature of my work, where I'm working a lot with students throughout the day. Sometimes I'm working with survivors. I'm holding a lot throughout the day. And so sometimes at the end of the day, I am exhausted. And even the thought of like calling my mom, which is often an easy conversation, or sometimes I just do not even have the energy for that. And that's sometimes where my curmudgeoniness like comes from, is I'm holding so much throughout the day that like, even if I sort of want that connection at the end of the day, I don't have the energy for it. I wonder if sometimes it's about that balance where like, if you're thinking about a planet, and so then you have more capacity or like you're looking for more connection because your work is not abstract, isn't the right word, but is not putting you in maybe as much of like an interpersonal space. So you are looking for and have more capacity for that like connection piece.
I can totally see that. I think that is true. I think it's less like the nature of what I'm doing in my work, but it's definitely like the format of my work, which is
Mm,
I work from home and like I live with my partner. He goes into the office. I am by myself all day, every day.
yeah.
And if I don't call my mom every day at lunchtime or be texting people or send a Snapchat of my cat. So this keeps me going.
Kind of to that point sort of leads me to asking about homework at one of the other scales. The origin of homework was my work with survivors of sexual violence. And so one of the first places that homework started to emerge was this idea of how do we come to feel at home in our body minds. And part of that was through this sort of reckoning of the experiences of the pandemic. And so you mentioned that you work from home and your partner goes to the office, and so you spend most of the days by yourself. And so connecting virtually with your friends and family is one of the ways that you seek connection and probably are maintaining that sense of home for yourself. Are there other practices that you have? I try to move away from ideas of like self-care because we've talked on the pod before. It's very like pull your mental self up by your bootstraps kind of things. But like, how do you sort of maintain your well-being across time and place to really maintain that sense of home for yourself?
I guess things that are consistent. Like I really am like a creature of habit. And, I love things to be largely the same. But if I'm somewhere new, there are some things that I can do that are very familiar to me. And like home definitely to me means like familiarity. And, even if it's something as simple as like I moved to a new place, but I know that the same podcasts that I've been listening to every single week for years are still going to happen. And it's something that I can go for a walk and I can listen to this podcast the same as I would no matter where I am. Things like that are very relaxing and bring me peace and that sense of familiarity. I know you guys talk a lot about movies on the pod. That's always something that, I'm a big rewatcher. I like to reread the same books over and over again. Things like that are always there in my home or my apartment or my house or wherever I am. I can feel at home in that space by returning to things that have been comforting to me in the past.
Bear with me, listeners and fellow members of the pod, because I know it's going to sound pretentious as fuck when it comes out. Um,
I'm hyped. I can't wait. Okay.
Oh man, I don't even want to say it, but I'm like, I have a point. Because I can see it in your fucking eyes, Brett. If you're watching the pod, I will not take this out. It's there. Okay, so I've been working on a novel. Fuck that line. But anyway, I've been working on this book, and I've told people that a lot of my characters, because it's fiction, I try not to base characters on people that I know unless they're villainous or for comic relief, because then I'm
Get one? Do I get to be villainous?
I can't. I don't like.
Can I be the muscle? I'm the bodyguard.
So I've been writing a particular character, and I will say this. So this was loosely inspired by something that actually, Madison, you just brought up, and so I don't know. Maybe I was thinking about you subconsciously, but anyway, I try not to write my friends into it unless I guess now you've asked for it, because I don't want it to feel hurtful. But I do write my enemies in as people that are both villainous and for comic relief, because I just am like, this is my petty revenge. So anyway, so one of the characters that I write is I describe them as an albatross, which for listeners, probably a lot of you think about albatross now as it relates to Taylor Swift. We're not going there, okay? Woman butchered it. But what you're describing of I have this place that I make home. I have this nest. I have this place that I'm always returning to, whether it's like Rhode Island or even like my space. And then I wander. Reminds me of an albatross. And it's something that I describe as one of the characters in the book of like the albatross goes for hundreds of miles. They leave, but they both mate for life and they always nest in the same place. They are the most interesting and cool birds to see. If you ever get the opportunity to see an albatross in the wild, they're magnificent. But it reminds me and it makes me think about how you're thinking through homework of an albatross, of someone who goes far and wide. You are a person who, if I call and I say, hey, let's plan a trip to France or Egypt, or we've been to the UAE, you're the person that's like, hell yeah, like, let's go do something. Let's get out of here. Let's explore the world. but you always are the person that like, turns to that same place. And I don't know, as it relates to like homework, it kind of feels like Maddie, you're a little bit maybe as a planetary doctor, someone who's an explorer. You're always looking for new things, for new places, but your nest where you come back to is always the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. And something that, relating to the sort of academia episode, the postdoc lifestyle is so like transient and everything is so temporary, and inherent in these jobs is you get a 2-year contract. I'm literally moving from the East Coast to the West Coast for a 2-year contract. And then what? Am I going to have to do it again? Maybe. And that can be really hard, but it can also be a cool opportunity. I was applying for these jobs all over the place, and I really kind of wanted to go back home and go back to New England. And there was a second where I was like, oh man, we got to go to California. And then I came around to be like, wow, I can't wait. This is going to be a totally new experience. This is going to be a new home. Rhode Island's always going to be there. I can go do something new for 2 years. Maybe I'll go back after that. Maybe it'll be the following round of job applications. But this is sort of, my Taylor Swift California era. And then, maybe I'll be in a new era after that. But I can always go back later to what I consider sort of like real home and make a new home somewhere else, even if it's just for a couple of years. It doesn't always work, like Brett and I were just saying in Arizona, it didn't work. And sometimes it's just sort of not right. I don't know. And in Arizona, I think part of it was that the relationships really play a big role. And specifically, my relationship with my partner, who will be getting married soon, finally. But in Arizona, we were doing long distance and he was still on the East Coast. And so I always had one foot out the door in Arizona, and we were constantly trying to go visit each other. And I was just sort of waiting all the time, just waiting for the next time I got to leave and then leave after that. And never put down roots, never wanted to put down roots, and was just sort of counting down the time until I could go. When I left there and I came to Georgia because my partner is here, I instantly felt more at home because he was already here. So my home was already built, and I've loved it so much more than I ever loved living there. And it's hard to say how much of that is just because I have someone here who's already my home. I don't know.
And I think to that point, homework is not inherently the thing that helps us feel settled. Sometimes it is the work that helps us just make it through.
All right, we're back, folks. What an interesting chat with the lovely Dr. Madison Borrelli.
Yeah, Venus doctor. So fun.
Yeah, this is where my qualitative brain sometimes is not good at respecting the quants. I respect what they do, couldn't do it. She does a lot of math. That's all I know. But, she studies Venus, and as she once told a congressman, Earth and other planets or something. I don't know. If you were in the room, shout out to those old days on the Hill when we had to make ourselves seem less woke than we actually were. But yeah, Dr. Brett, before our pause, we were talking a little bit about the ways that we think about homework for ourselves and what is home. And I think it was really fascinating with the conversation with Borrelli, and that she instantly had that answer, and that was a place for her. That is the place that she grew up.
Yeah.
And I'm both curious, does that feel similar to you? Does Chicago feel that way? For me, it would be Arizona. And I feel this. Oh, that's home. And that when I go home, I know it like the back of my hand. I don't need a map. I can get around that city. I know all of my old gin joints, all the old haunts. It is a script that I have read and memorized. But I don't know if I feel the same way of that being the place that I always return to. And I'm curious about this from your perspective because process, I guess, of homework, or this idea of place feels interesting to me as a geographer, and interesting to me as Nicole, who sits in my own brain all the time, because I don't know if I can relate to always wanting to go back to the same place. There is this thing I've heard about when you visit a new place, whether it be a city or a home or something, and you feel this kind of excitement in a new space, that what it means cosmically is that you have unfinished business there. I think this is really interesting. For a long time, that was Washington, D.C. And so now I live here, can confirm, not the end of the journey, but I felt this specific tug and this pull. And so thinking about homework is interesting And I know we've talked about it as a process, but there's a part of me that just genuinely also wants it to be a physical space that suddenly all of the noise stops, all of the longing of being somewhere else ends. And I finally feel this is maybe it's my trauma coming out from childhood, of like, this is the home that I want to be in and that I will feel settled and I will be happy to get up every morning and not think about, oh, where else could I go? Where else could I be? Is this
Yeah.
the end of it? And so I'm just kind of curious because I feel like Borrelli's comments is what I want to be, and I respect it so much, but it also feels so different than how I think about home.
Yeah. For me, even though I often name different places that I think about when I think of home, I really have not associated home with a place for a very, very long time. For a while, I identified as a New Yorker. I don't really anymore. I moved to New York for undergrad. I was there for 2 weeks and 9/11 happened. And very quickly, I did identify as a New Yorker. I felt a part of that city. It was fundamental to my identity and my sense of home for a very long time. And then that was intimately connected with my partner, and our relationship was very much a New York relationship. Occupy Sandy, fundamentally for me, New York experiences. Then when I left, and my goal was to be away for 2 years before I went back. And I was a little short of that when I went back to visit right after um, I had been in uh, Costa Rica and Guatemala, and very different experiences than, and right after New York, I was in Minneapolis for the first time for like 9 months, then Costa Rica, Guatemala, and then back to New York to visit. And having been in Central America for a year where it's very communal, people say, hola, ¿cómo está? Living in a little Mayan village as one of two almost 6 foot tall gringas, we stood out, and um, it, and then going back to my neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and people did not look you in the eye. People did not say hello. The thing that I loved about New York for so much of that experience was the ability to be alone, surrounded by 10 million people. I loved that feeling for a long time. And then I didn't. And it felt isolating. And New York hadn't changed, but I had changed. And that was probably the moment that I stopped being a New Yorker, even though I continued to identify as such for a long time. I don't think that I have identified with a place since that. For a long time, I tried to put down roots in Minnesota, and I described that like Minnesota resisted those efforts at every turn. And it would have been easy to experience that as rejection, but I tried to reframe that as Minnesota telling me to keep pushing. Like, you're, not to like settle down. I don't feel like I'm a Southern Californian. I'm coming up on 4 years. I don't identify with this place yet, or I don't know if I ever will. In a lot of ways, this place doesn't feel like home, even though people here feel like home to me. Even as a geographer, I think you and I are too much of the cultural geographers that I don't know if it is the place that feels like home. It is the people.
I was also talking to a friend earlier today where we were describing the inability to be able to fully enjoy something. And I was, well, this is what happens when you have two people that love the classics. We spend so much time in the books and admiring another time that it's really hard to be fully present in the one that you're in. Because there's always something that you're thinking about, or you're always making up a story about something that doesn't always come true. And I'm curious, and maybe this is a good segue to give you some space to maybe bridge this. You'll see what I'm doing. I'm going to bridge maybe what you're working on now, what you've been working on, and what's something that you also alluded that you're working to. Because I've talked about not feeling settled in certain places, and I totally feel that. Yeah, since I moved to DC, I don't feel like this is home. But I also don't know what that other place is, and I feel those callings towards places, and one might call them hauntings. I sort of feel like there are these ghosts in different places that I'm chasing, or even to connect this to your work, in that you're working with a lot of folks who have survived immense trauma. I think most of us who have experienced trauma in some way recognize that it doesn't ever go away fully. It's always sort of part of what you carry with you. And I have been very interested recently in self-examining how my trauma is manifesting now. And, arguably the most stable I've ever been in my life, and why that is still coming up in new and unexpected ways. But I'm curious, in this process of hauntings, of maybe forward thinking, but then also the past of what we're carrying, how we think about those things that are like unsettling us, that are both part of the story and the story that we want to create for ourselves through our homework.
So, homework as being the journey, I think, is also giving me some of the tools to the project that I'm actively kind of researching right now in collaboration with one of my grad students is about suicide and living with suicidal ideations and looking at suicide as cultural phenomenon and sort of how we think about it, talk about it, ignore it, deal with it as a cultural and sort of social phenomenon, because that is an experience that is and has been haunting for me for decades. But then also, to your point, the other project that is kind of also on the back burner for me that I think will soon go more actively into development. I always write titles first. That's just
As you
even
should.
back when I was writing scripts, I often had the title first and then was like, all right, now I just need to create something that is worth this title. But so this other project I think it's going to be called Hauntings, Men, Masculinities, and Sexual Violence. That is about the violence that men experience as opposed to what what I often talk about as well is like the violence that men inflict. And it will include some of that because it doesn't live in a vacuum, but it is about the dehumanization of like masculine socialization, and what men are put through in order to become men in this culture. And I think as a final note on homework, even though I'm sure it'll keep coming up on the pod now that we've introduced it.
Yeah, we've opened the floodgates. So
we've opened the floodgates. And as folks are sitting with it, are reflecting on it, I think the point that I want to reiterate is that homework is often the labor, not that helps us settle, but homework is the labor that helps us make it through.
Damn. Yeah, it's perfect. Well, let's pause and then we'll come back for our signature closing segment, More Common Than a Question. All right, folks, welcome back to the Dr. Talk podcast. We are here for our classic signature closing segment, More Common Than a Question. And no, we're not taking any follow-ups. Because we have an extra doc, though, who I know always has more comments than genuinely questions, Dr. Madison Borrelli. But we thought we'd invite Borrelli to come back in and do the segment with us. So, Dr. Borrelli, do us the honor. What is your more comment than question?
Okay, are you familiar with the Same Height Party? Have you ever seen pictures of this?
No.
Look it up, look up Same Height Party, and some sort of, I think like maybe an art piece. And it's everyone who enters wears these tall, like platform shoes to be the same height. So the shorter people put on these really tall shoes of all varying heights so that everyone is one equal height. My idea, and my more of a comment than a question, is every concert should be this. So I, as a very short person, I recently found out I'm even shorter than I thought. I'm not even 5'2". So it's tough. If you go to a standing room concert and I happen to be behind someone who's very tall, I can't see anything. And that's not fair. I paid the same price for this ticket as this tall person did, and they're getting a way better view than I am. So I prefer, sort of seated concert seats for that reason. Or they should have tall platform shoes available for us short people so that, even if just to reach maximum of, say, 6 feet, that's still pretty tall. I should be able to rent or, for free of charge, put on very tall platform shoes at the venue so that I can get my fare and my money's worth out of my concert ticket. That's my more comment question.
Damn, I have many responses, but not allowed. Not allowed according to the rules. So, Dr.
You can
Brett,
send Dr. Maddie a pod off.
Yes.
We'll follow up. We'll be in touch.
Yeah. So my comment this week, much less fun than Dr. Maddie's. So right about 10 years ago, I was living in, or I was right about to move to Guatemala for a month to write my master's thesis. I was in Costa Rica doing my completing my master's in gender and peace building. And my master's thesis I wrote over the course of about a month following a series of pretty public mass shootings where men were targeting college-age women. This was like Dylan Roof was the most recent one.
Yeah.
This was up in Santa Barbara. So that was 10 years ago. That thesis was titled Men Who Hate Women. If anyone is interested in reading it, reach out. I will send it to you. That was 10 years ago. Nothing has changed. Everything has gotten worse. I'm assuming this will be a topic on the pod soon. But we have learned over the last week or so about an online rape academy where men are teaching one another how to drug and rape their wives and their partners. Men are trash, and online masculinity culture is a disease. I will not be taking any follow-ups.
Nor should you. Okay, let's see. My more of a comment than a question this week is, I don't want to jinx it, but my comment is like, am I jinxing myself? I guess which is a question, but like, I don't know. The rules say that it's a comment. I just saw the trailer for Practical Magic 2, which comes out later this year in September. I'm a big fan of Practical Magic 1. Even though, like, I came to it late in life, only in the last couple of years. And honestly, like, it's not a well-written script, in my opinion. Like, it's not, but the vibes are solid. Like, the margarita scene.
Banger cast.
It's so good. It makes me immediately want to blend a margarita and put it into my Macayo's margarita cup. If you know, you know. If you don't, I'll link it in the show notes. But love it. I was really energized to hear that they were doing a follow-up to it. I'm a little concerned because, and maybe, you know, this will be remedied, but so far the plot describes it as 25 years later after the first movie. And I don't know if that's because it's like correct or if that's what the timeline actually is. But then I had like a skepticism in that because the kids are supposedly the same kids that were in the last movie. And I'm like, they still look like children 25 years later. Is it witchcraft or is it a typo? Like, I don't know. However, I don't want to jinx it, but the trailer looks good, and it's one of the few trailers that like isn't giving away primary plot points, which I really appreciate in this day and age. But I am, as I've said on the pod before, very skeptical of most sequels or remakes. So anyway, but I'm like I'm excited. I'm throwing it out there. Maybe we should all get together and go to a little spooky party in September. But yeah, I'm excited for Practical Magic 2. If you haven't seen the trailer, go watch it. It might bring you a little joy in the world that is otherwise, as we have described lots on this pod, pretty shitty.
Doc to Doc is co-hosted, written, produced, and edited by us, Dr. Brett S. Goldberg and Dr. Nicole K. Mayberry. Our original music was written and performed by Matt Bogdanow, and our original artwork was illustrated by Andre Gonzalez. Doc to Doc is an independent podcast and a conversation across place, perspective, and friendship. We record Doc to Doc between Washington, D.C. and Orange County, California. In Washington, D.C., we record on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank Anacostans, also known as the Anacostan or Nacotchtank peoples, and near the lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. In Orange County, we record on the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Hashiman and Tongva tribal nations.